Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a technological revolution that completely transformed the American countryside, taking people quite literally from candlelight into the modern era. Today, we're unpacking the history of early rural electrification. We so often take just flipping a switch for granted today, but the journey to get reliable power out to remote, off-grid farms, it's an absolutely incredible tale of engineering and ingenuity, and I'm super excited to share it with you.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this. It's the early 20th century, and the municipal electrical grid doesn't reach your farm. How do you turn on the lights? I want you to imagine the reality of living completely off the grid before modern infrastructure was even a thing. This wasn't just some minor inconvenience when the sun went down. It defined your entire way of life. When evening fell, the day's hard work either came to a grinding halt, or it had to carry on under the dim, flickering, and frankly dangerous glow of primitive lighting.
To really wrap our heads around what this was like, let's look at the first-hand memories of Wilma Jean Smith. Wilma grew up on a farm in Patton, Iowa, in the 1920s. Recalling her childhood, she wrote, "We read and studied by the light of an Aladdin lamp. I remember how fragile the wick was and how it sounded." By grounding this history in Wilma's deeply personal, lived experience, we can truly appreciate the massive, life-altering magnitude of the technology that was about to arrive at her family's door.
Now, during this era, the technological divide was stark. On one hand, urban areas were rapidly modernizing. We're talking bright street lights, electric trolleys, shiny new home appliances. But on the other hand, sometimes just a few miles outside those city limits were totally dark rural farms like the Smiths. Out there, life still required intense, grueling manual labor. Think about it, relying entirely on oil lamps and lanterns, pumping water by hand from an outside well, and trekking out to an outhouse in the freezing cold. The countryside was literally left in the dark.
Enter Charles F. Kettering and the Delco light system. Kettering was actually an Ohio farm boy himself, but he grew up to be an absolute engineering genius. He had already made a massive name for himself by inventing the electric starter for the Cadillac, which was a huge deal because it meant people no longer had to dangerously hand-crank their car engines. But because he knew the everyday struggles of farm life firsthand, he set his sights on an even bigger problem. How do we bring a decentralized, reliable power supply directly to rural families cut off from the grid?
To crack this, Kettering's team developed the Delco Light Plant Generator, and it was a remarkably compact unit. It paired a 1.5 horsepower, air-cooled gasoline engine with a generator and a bank of lead batteries. At full load, an average unit pumped out about 750 watts of electricity. To put that into perspective for you, that's enough power to run 15 50-watt light bulbs simultaneously. For a farmhouse that was used to gathering around a single fragile oil lamp, flipping a switch to that level of illumination was nothing short of a miracle.
Now, what's really interesting about this setup is its incredibly ingenious, low-maintenance, automated charging process. Remember, we're in the 1910s and 20s. Farmers were incredibly busy. They didn't have time to play mechanic all day. So Delco made the system practically self-sufficient. When the battery's charge dropped below a preset level, the engine would literally kick on by itself. It would run until the batteries were fully charged and then completely shut itself off. The generator only worked when it was strictly needed. For the owner, it basically meant just refilling the gas tank and checking the oil and acid levels every now and then.
Of course, there was a bit of a gap between the slick marketing and the reality. The heroic Delco light posters depicted the system as this almost mythological force bringing radiant power to the farm. But your typical basement installation was a lot more grounded. It featured this large wooden shelf rack holding 16 big, clear glass jars. These were open lead-acid batteries, all connected in a series. Each jar gave off 1 to 2 volts, and together they combined to produce 32 volts of direct current, enough to power the farm's entire electrical system.
But how do you actually sell a complex mechanical system to a skeptical farmer who has never even used electricity? Well, the Delco salesman had a brilliant tactic. They would intentionally drive up to a farm right at dusk, just as the darkness was settling in. Their vehicles were equipped with a portable Delco light system. They'd hook it up, and suddenly, they'd magically flood the dark barn with bright light. Then they'd use it to power a water pump, proving right then and there that back-breaking hand pumping was a thing of the past. And for the grand finale, they brewed a fresh cup of coffee for everyone present using an electric coffee maker. I mean, tasting that fresh coffee while standing in a brightly lit barn sold the system better than any technical spec sheet ever could.
Let's transition back to life on the Smith farm in Patton, Iowa, to see the tangible impact of this invention. Wilma's father, Arthur Edward Smith, was a hard-working guy who loved working the soil, and he instantly saw the immense value in this new tech.
He eventually purchased one of these Delco motors and installed it right in their earth-walled basement. And let me tell you, that single purchase completely changed the trajectory of the family's daily life. It brought the modern magic of electricity straight into their rural home. And the memories it created for the family were just so vivid. Wilma later wrote, "I can shut my eyes, drift back in time, and actually hear that Delco putt, putt, putt." I want you to really lean into that sensory detail for a second. That rhythmic putt, putt, putt of the gas engine kicking on down in the basement wasn't some loud annoyance. To Wilma and her sisters, it was the comforting sound of modern convenience. It signaled that they had bright light to read by and power to make their daily chores just that much easier.
Now, it wasn't perfectly seamless magic, right? As Wilma also remembered, when it would run down, the lights would go dim and Daddy had to charge the battery. This highlights the manual realities that absolutely still existed even with this incredible machine. Her father, who Wilma fondly described as a devoted Christian farmer who loved to whistle hymns as he worked, he still had to actively help maintain the system and keep a close eye on those 16-glass batteries so his family wouldn't end up back in the dark.
Yet, when you compare the before and after, the difference is just staggering. Before the Delco plant, Wilma recalled how her mother had to wash clothes using a massive 5-gallon wash tub filled with buckets of soft water from a cistern, which was all heated manually on a stove fueled by cobs from the barnyard. It was incredibly heavy, back-breaking work. The generator provided this unbelievable automated relief. It literally paved the way for electric water pumps and modern conveniences that saved hours of intense physical labor every single day.
So the crucial point here is that the Smith family was far from alone in this transition. This technology absolutely exploded across rural America. Kettering actually sold Delco to General Motors in 1918, and by 1928, General Motors reported to its shareholders that more than 350,000 Delco Light units had been sold. That is hundreds of thousands of farms finally stepping out of the 19th century and enjoying the massive benefits of electricity, all completely independent of any municipal power grid.
However, the era of the isolated basement generator couldn't last forever. Enter President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1935, FDR created the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA. This massive government initiative really signaled the eventual, inevitable end for those decentralized Delco generators. The goal was no longer to rely on individual battery banks and basements, but to string massive networks of power lines to connect rural America directly to the main national grid.
And the sheer scale of this government intervention was staggering. Over just a couple of years following the 1936 Rural Electrification Act, the government spent an astonishing $210 million. With that funding, they laid 160,000 kilometers of power lines across the country. This monumental effort successfully provided main grid electricity to 220,000 farms. Wilma noted in her journals that the Smith farm eventually hooked up to the REA-2, finally trading their beloved putt-putt-putt generator for standard electric lights.
Let's look at how this builds, because the pace of this modernization was breathtaking. The Delco Light system was introduced in 1916, bringing those very first sparks of decentralized power. By 1928, it reached peak popularity with 350,000 units sold. Yet just 7 years later, the REA was created, followed rapidly by the Rural Electrification Act in 1936. Within the span of just 20 years, we went from the very first introduction of automated basement generators to a massive, federally funded national grid expansion. It's just an astonishingly swift modernization of American infrastructure.
It really makes you think about the relentless pace of progress, doesn't it? As technology continues to rapidly reshape our lives, moving from off-grid basement generators to the globally interconnected networks we rely on today, what everyday putt-putt-putt miracle will we be nostalgic for tomorrow? The machines that define our modern convenience right now might just be tomorrow's quiet, comforting memory of a bygone era. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, tracing the forgotten spark of rural America. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.